Thanks very much, everyone. This is going to be a slight change of direction from some of the other papers, which is indeed part of the point. But let me just start by saying, yes, King's College London, as a couple of you I had conversations with yesterday, I also have a role in the UK House of Commons. I should say that I'm not speaking in any respect as a representative of the UK House of Commons. I'm presenting as me, because I am me. So, probably the most unnecessary audience to put this slide in front of, but there's quite a lot of interest in extremism. You might be aware of this. And the starting point of this presentation really goes back to a chapter that I wrote for one of Rick's edited volumes, observing that there is something rather unsatisfying about the fact that the overwhelming bulk, not literally all, but the overwhelming bulk of work on extremism focuses on non-state actors, so terrorists, armed groups, fringe political movements, cults, incel communities, etc., etc. And the books and reports on the slide here are some examples of that. That ought to strike us as very odd, I think. And it's not just a focus, happenstance of existing research. If we look at some classic definitions of terrorism, many either explicitly state that extremism is only a phenomenon of non-state actors. So this first definition on the slide, by definition, political extremism represents fringe ideas and actions that draw ire and repression from mainstream society. If that's the case, the state cannot be extremist, right? Governments can't be extremist. They're clearly part of the mainstream, in many ways define the mainstream. Other definitions, it's not actually explicit, but it is implicit within the definition that we could not be talking about states when we talk about extremists. So, for example, the FBI's definition of violent extremism, encouraging, condoning, justifying, or supporting the commission of a violent act to achieve political, ideological, religious, social, or economic goals. Under that definition, any support for war by your own state, including in self-defense against another group, would be counted as extremist, right? It's obviously a violent act, your state fighting a war, to achieve political, ideological, religious, social, economic goals. The FBI consider it so obvious that we wouldn't be talking about states that they don't even need to design the definition to explicitly rule out that possibility. It's just tacitly in there. Similarly, a very, very good book by Berger on extremism states the belief that an in-group success or survival is inseparable from the need for hostile action against an out-group. Berger's quite explicit that he does think that states can be extremist. But if that's the case, it doesn't really see how this definition could work. Clearly, sometimes states and their peoples are going to conclude that their success or survival is inseparable from the need for hostile action against an out-group. That's certainly what the Ukrainian state would believe right now, and I think a lot of us would consider them to have justified reasons to think that. More broadly, we should be dissatisfied with this restriction of extremism to non-state actors for three big and obvious reasons. The first is that clearly if you think that non-state actors, movements, political parties, etc. can be extremists, they might take control of the state. That happens. Presumably they don't suddenly stop being extremist on the point of capturing the state. That would seem odd. Secondly, state extremism ought to concern us because it's generally far more dangerous than non-state extremism. I take this to be one of the things that's represented by Cassim's quote here. If you take the whole course of the 20th century, about 80 million to 140 million civilians were killed by states in things that we would probably call extremist political violence. Genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. The equivalent figure for non-state actors, if you just take terrorism, it's about 500,000, minuscule. If you take all non-state violence, you might be up in around kind of 20 million, something like that, but less than states. Finally, we should be suspicious of this neglect of state extremism. It is manifest that it would serve states' interests to construct definitions and conceptualizations of extremism that make it impossible that they themselves might ever be accused of being extremists. I think we should be suspicious of that. So what I want to talk about in this talk, I kind of made this conceptual argument in an earlier chapter that I mentioned for Rick. What I want to talk about more in this talk is the subjectivity of state extremism. What do extremist states really look like, and how might that cause us to think in different ways about what extremism is? Shameless plug for the book that Cassim mentioned. This is sort of a premise of my research, is that extremism, I wouldn't say literally extremism is an ideology, I'd say it's a class of ideologies, but extremism is ideological, or at least political extremism is ideological by definition, in my view. I have a broad definition of ideologies, which is on the slide. I won't read it. One of the problems that we have in many debates over terrorism, extremism, and state violence is that people assume that when you talk about something being ideological, you are implicating certain conclusions that I think we should not be implicating. So when I say that extremism is ideological, all I mean is that extremism is guided by distinctive political worldviews, etc., etc. Okay? That does not mean that extremists necessarily have detailed, elaborate, well-defined belief systems. That's a caricature of ideology that most people, most socialists, conservatives, liberals, etc., do not meet. I'm not assuming that extremists are necessarily motivated by fanatical convictions. Plenty of people are influenced by ideologies without being fanatics or without having deep conviction in them. Indeed, ideologies can be important to explain phenomena even when people don't believe in the ideology at all. The example I always use is that in the 1980s, in the Soviet Union, pretty much everyone agrees that no one really believed in orthodox, official Soviet ideology anymore, and yet that ideology continued to structure mass behavior across society because it was embedded in norms and institutions in ways that created other forms of pressure on people's behavior. I'm not suggesting that the only thing motivating extremists is ideology. There might be lots of other things that might matter, nor am I suggesting that ideology, if extremism is ideological, that means that it's wildly irrational or involves a kind of complete disregard for strategic calculation or prudence. Indeed, ideologies, in my view, shape what is rational for people to believe and what they think are the best strategies for pursuing their aims. I won't go into all of the rest of this stuff, but that's just a kind of background premise of the way I approach the question of state extremism. So, there is, I think, an orthodox view of particularly state extremism, or they think it recurs into other work on extremism. Let me just say, what I really mean by that is people don't necessarily use the word state extremism, but there's an orthodox view of what's going on when certain ideologies lead states to do extreme things. And I think that bleeds into wider work on extremism. And that orthodox view claims that what makes states do extreme things are highly unconventional and radical values and goals that are alien, very different to the values and goals of normal politics and normal political actors. Again, that recurs, as I say, in work on extremism by non-state actors as well. Just to give some examples of people claiming these sorts of things, Kruglanski, mentioned earlier by another presenter, in one of the various papers says that extremism is defined as motivated deviance from general behavioral norms. The mainstream has the norms, the extremists deviate from those norms. Two books, famous books on mass violence by states. Robert Melson sees state violence, state mass violence as rooted in the need for revolutionaries to respond to the revolutionary situation and implement their ideological desires, right? They have transformative visions. They want to change society in extreme ways, different to the goals of normal societies. And one of the implications here, and you get this recurring through extremism all the time, is that what extremism involves is a kind of reversal of normal moral norms, right? A reversal of normal moral ideals and normal political objectives. In short, the roots of a kind of extremist mindset, and again, these scholars are mainly thinking about states, but I think you get this in the literature on non-state extremism too, should be sought in this kind of combination of political radicalism, utopian desires to eliminate certain groups or transform society, and also intense hatred. The book by Daniel Shiro is an example of this kind of argument. This view is wrong, and profoundly, in my view, distorts the way in which we have debates about extremism in society. And again, my focus here is on state extremism, but I'm going to come back to talk a little bit about non-state extremism if I have time at the end. Just before, in case you think that this is all just a scholarly problem, here are some quotes by some fairly influential people or institutions, very much expressing what I would call the orthodox view. Okay, Bush, someone else already yesterday quoted the same speech that I'm using here by Bush. They hate our freedom of religion, etc., etc. They want to overthrow existing governments, radical ideological plans, right? These terrorists kill not merely to end lives, but to disrupt and end a way of life. They want to reconstruct society according to their radical different values, by sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, etc., etc., right? You see how that resembles what I was describing. Somewhat less rhetorically, the British government, until very, very recently, defined extremism as the vocal or active opposition to our fundamental values, specifically British values. We define the mainstream, as I'm sure everyone in Europe will accept, including democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance, different faith and beliefs. Again, here extremism is about the rejection of conventional values. François Hollande, France came under attack for what it represents, for what it stands for its culture, our ways of living, as well as our values, our principles. So here's one reason to be suspicious of that argument. This is a poll, and I'd like you to focus on the middle row to start with. This is a poll conducted of American soldiers in World War II in 1944, I think November 1944, that asked, what would you like to see happen to the Japanese after the war? And 47% said punish the leaders, but not the ordinary Japanese. 9% said make Japanese people suffer aplenty. And 42% said wipe out the whole Japanese nation. I think most of us would think that that's a fairly extreme view. Okay? I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but there are some other interesting things on this poll. If you move from the poll of American soldiers fighting in the Pacific theater and instead polled American soldiers fighting in the European theater, the number of soldiers calling for the complete genocide of the Japanese nation rises to 61%, doesn't go down. And if you go back to American soldiers in training back in America, it rises to 67%. Two-thirds of all American soldiers in training in this poll thought that the thing to do after the end of World War II was to genocide the entire Japanese people. It is not plausible, in my view, to argue that these soldiers were committed to non-mainstream, anti-conventional, revolutionary, utopian values or goals. Right? This is a standard section of soldiers in America, in an exceptional circumstance, which I will come back to, but fairly standard people, certainly within the mainstream of American society at the time. So my argument is that the conventional, the orthodox view of extremism and state action as rooted in these kind of radical values and goals is wrong. Rather than being rooted in unconventional ideas, extremism, particularly state extremism, and there are reasons why particularly state extremism, is actually dependent on conventional, strategic and moral ideas, particularly those bound up with what we might generally call security politics, right? So the fighting of war, concepts of self-defense, concepts of policing and punishment, these are the ideas that I would say extremists, when they take over states and engage in extreme action, overwhelmingly draw on. The reason why we haven't acknowledged or noticed that, because I think it's fairly obvious once you start to look at what extremist states actually say and what they do and how they justify their actions to their own societies and also privately between elite decision makers, is because there is a persistent, overly sanitized image of the quote-unquote conventional ideas of mainstream society going on. In a lot of this literature, people write as though, in order for people to do violence, the normal voice of conscience or primeval moral drives, I'm literally quoting quotes from works here, have to be neutralized because that primeval conscience, that natural morality, the norms of conventional society, the standard moral rules, rule out killing. Now that is very, very obviously not true. The conventional norms of societies all over the world, for the vast bulk of human history, have ruled out killings by private individuals, but not killing in all circumstances. They have seen killing in the context of war and usually state punishment of particularly extreme offenders as entirely legitimate exercises of state power and collective social power, we might want to say. That is the conception that is actually dominant in the ideological fabric of most societies, and it is that conception that is radicalized by extremists in important ways. The main way in which they radicalize those conventional ideas is by attaching them to extreme narratives, right? Not extreme values and goals. The values and goals in most cases remain quite normal: defend the group, punish the criminals, save us from the wrongdoers. But the narratives are extreme. We are under attack from apocalyptic threats, malevolent, hidden, unverifiable conspiracies hidden within society, terrible plots and treasons that are being orchestrated against our in-group. Okay? And once you attach these sort of conventional ideas about self-defense and punishment to these kind of narratives, what I want to suggest you end up with is something that we might call an ideology of war politique. Politics becomes seen as merely another kind of warfare. It becomes dominated by the fight against these kind of existential threats that you purport exist to society. And one of the consequences of that, and this goes back to one of the earlier presentations, is that you get a kind of ideology of politics that is fundamentally deregulated from the kind of ethical constraints that normally limit politics into dominantly non-violent or at least regulated forms of violence. Now, I think that's a particularly powerful form of ideology because you don't need to be consumed by hate or radical goals. You don't have to undergo some kind of moral conversion in order to become swept up in it. You can actually work off your fairly common familiarity with accepted ideas, and if you accept the narrative, there's a sort of way in which it seems logically implicated that this is a reasonable response. So I don't think there is sort of one extremist mindset. This is probably something that, again, everyone in this room will agree with. There's a diverse range of extremists, and this is a powerful vehicle for drawing people into extremism. Now, I'm not claiming that there are no unconventional elements in extremist ideologies. There may well be hatreds, there may well be utopian goals, there may well be extreme forms of racism and so on. I'm just saying that they're not necessary, they're not at the heart of what makes states extremist in most cases. Now, I'm not going to read all the things on this slide, and I might go through them too quickly for you to read every element of them. But what I've done here is put up some fairly representative examples of how, some of these are from private documents, some of these are from public documents, how leaders of states we would probably all call extremist, or states that we would at least think are engaged in extremist actions, actually defend what they're doing. So this is taken from the Soviet Union, both the Red Terror at the sort of latter year of the Russian Civil War, and then also the Great Terror in 1936 to 37 under Stalin. What you see in general is not your standard vision of communism and communist violence as the idea of the communists believed in a utopian society and they thought certain groups had to be excluded, and so in pursuit of the utopian society they killed them all. That's not how the Soviet leaders ever internally or externally justified their actions. Instead, it was through this standard language of threat and self-defense and war. Talk about the threat posed by kulaks, that was a kind of contradictory concept within Bolshevik ideology for capitalist peasants, the growing danger of fascist aggression, the fifth column and conspiracies inside of the country. It's this security language that really dominates what animated kind of Soviet leaders in this period. Similarly, if you go to the Guatemalan Civil War, which was waged from early 1960s to 1996 between a kind of ultra-conservative, largely military Guatemalan government and a left-wing insurgency. Between 1978 and 1983, the Guatemalan government engaged in mass killing of largely indigenous Mayan people that they saw as being associated with the insurgency, despite the fact that the vast bulk of the Mayan indigenous population had no links with the insurgency at all. Again, not really radical visions of society or radical goals. What you see instead is this just extreme narrative of warfare, total war, existential threats to the community, and the need for the state to respond in the face of this guerrilla threat posed by the insurgency. Again, I know I'm going forwards pretty quick, but you can always pull me back to these slides if you want to interrogate any of them. The Rwandan genocide in 1994. These are an example of a public speech and then an example of a private interview conducted later. Again, the senior orchestrators of the Rwandan genocide did not present themselves as transforming society. They did not present themselves as working off radical values or goals. They said we are in a civil war, which was true, and we face a existential threat, arguably potentially also true, or eventually the Rwandan government that orchestrated the genocide was defeated by the insurgency. And this threat is supported by conspiracies running through all of the civilian population of Tutsis in the country. False. Okay? But that extreme narrative allowed them to claim that to do anything other than actually preemptively attack the Tutsi was just to leave themselves open to extermination of the Hutu majority people. Again, arguments of self-defense and security threats. To give a slightly more modern example, not quite as extreme as some of the most blatant cases like the Holocaust or Rwandan genocide perhaps, but Putin today similarly has justified both the invasion of Ukraine and actions in Ukraine in essentially these same terms, right? This is a kind of ultra-conservative authoritarian argument about national security and self-defense. That Ukraine has been taken over by a neo-Nazi movement that is committing genocide or planning genocide against the Russian minorities within Ukraine, and therefore Russia has to act in order to save people, save fellow Russians in Ukraine. Okay? There are other elements, as you'll probably be familiar with, of Putin's worldview that are more esoteric. Again, I'm not denying that those elements exist, but the dominant appeal remains to this kind of security language. So in that very rapid tour, I want to suggest that these are fairly representative of cases of state violence. I've worked on what we might call state extremism, although I tend to call it just state violence, for about a decade and a half, and my argument, entirely on authority, is that this is the dominant kind of language. And again, there are some questions we might want to have here about, okay, how much faith can we put in these statements, right? There are many reasons why states might appeal to these kind of justifications when really their deeper motives remain utopianism or more radical hatreds or something like that. I don't totally disagree with that claim, but I would say two things. One, I'm not suggesting that we just take what states say and swallow it unthinkingly and uncritically. What generally people like me who try and engage with ideology do is to triangulate those statements against observable behaviour, and also what it's plausible to kind of think that people might really believe or really claim based on the circulation of ideas within the institutions and contexts in which they operate. And in general, I would say it's not just superficial discourse. It looks like something that actually guides what these political leaders and states do. But also, even to the extent, again, that this might not be exactly what elite leaders of states really believe, the fact that these are the terms of public justification matters, right? That ought to interest us, because that suggests that the enabling, legitimating conditions for violence, even if it's not the underlying motives, remain bound up with these kind of security-centric, war-centric ideology of war politique justifications that I've described. So again, the bulk of my work has been on states, and my argument here is that this is particularly true of states because of the way states need to maintain control and legitimacy amongst broad populations. It's more plausible for small non-state actors or fringe movements to have more esoteric values and ideas, perhaps like the incels, for example, because they don't need to mobilize the mass population of a society to support them. Nevertheless, I would say even in non-state cases, such as this original fatwa against the West in 1998, produced by Al-Qaeda, extremists depend far more on these standard but radicalized ideas about war and security than people realize, and certainly more than they do on kind of revolutionary goals. Again, Al-Qaeda's justification for its violence consistently across a wide range of publications has always essentially been not about the imposition of Sharia law or of Islamic values. It's consistently been about the idea of we are under attack by the West and we have a justified right to retaliate in self-defense and punishment against them. Similarly, Anders Behring Breivik, the far-right murderer of 47 people, I think it was in Utøya in Norway. Again, all of his justification in his extremely boring 1,000-page manifesto is essentially in the language of threat and retaliation and glorious war. Okay? Drawn, I would say, from certain conventional ideas. So just to finish, I'm gone 1 minute longer than I wanted to. Where I think this goes is, first of all, we need to think in our explanatory accounts of extremism more about the way in which extremists draw on the values of the mainstream, and they draw upon conventionally accepted ideas of the mainstream. I think that makes people's conversion to extremism much more plausible than if you assume that some kind of radical inversion and abandonment of conventional morality and conventional ideas about society is required in order to become an extremist. Again, not saying that never happens, but in the majority of cases I don't think it does. Secondly, I think, and here I'm supporting several other publications at this workshop, this supports a sort of broader, slow-moving shift in focus on research on political violence, away from these kind of abstract, long-standing hatreds and revolutionary fanaticism, and towards a more focus on things like conspiracy theories, militarism, broader polarizations between identities and sorting of people into groups. That's the much more sort of standard material out of which I think extremism is built. Finally, and I've lost a word here, or maybe I just never typed it in the first place, who knows. But I think in more policy terms, I'm not suggesting that this means that we never respond to extremism with security policies, but we do need to recognize the cost to doing that, right? Securitization of extremism feeds the very logic that extremists depend on to justify their own actions. And certainly I would say a lot of research suggests that in many cases it is the worst way in which to react to extremism. I think some of the links that I've been describing, both from state and non-state actors, can explain why that's the case. Okay, I want to leave time for questions, so I'll stop there. Thanks.